prices are going up everywhere on everything. So let's talk about inflation and prices rising. Somebody emailed me a couple weeks ago. I think I forgot to respond. But he said, to help, where do I put my money? My national currency just went down 10% in the last week. What do I do? Do I invest in Bitcoin, gold, silver? What stocks? This guy didn't know what to do. In a true hyperinflation scenario, there's no good answer to that question. In the long term, of course, the best option is to store some of your savings in assets that tend to survive hyperinflation, i.e. anything that's not a fiat currency or not valued. For example, gold, silver, Bitcoin, land. And then you get into more materially important things that are actually important in a time of crisis. And hyperinflation can actually bring about crisis, looting, system collapses, things like that, and as well as famine. So you get to more material things that are less important in a monetary sense and more important in a survival sense, like not just that you own land somewhere, but you own land that produces food actively and you're on the land also, right? You actually being there as well. Things like tools and technology and social capital, which is basically community and friendships and family, because you can't survive on your own. If your neighborhood is full of people of the other political persuasion, they're not going to be very helpful in a crisis. In fact, they're probably going to be the angry mob burning down your house because you won't give them what you saved up for your family in time of crisis. So obviously you need to be sure that the people around you are going to be helpful or useful. And if not, why are you where you are? So a lot of people kind of envision these hyperinflation scenarios where food prices are going up each week. And they think of how it might be. And I'm going to explain how it's not really that way. But first, I just saw a headline that kind of reminded me to make a video like this just a few minutes ago. Germany, a headline came up from Reuters that said German supermarket chains announced that starting on Monday, food prices were going to go up 20 to 50%. 20 to 50%. Now, everyone is used to that. Around the world and in the United States, everyone's been seeing grocery store prices rise significantly throughout the last few years. Everything's just gone way up. And obviously throughout the last 20 years, but it's accelerated in the past couple of years noticeably. So that even normal people are noticing it, which is why the media had to basically blame it all on COVID and then now blaming it all on Ukraine. So they're going to need to create nonstop crises to blame the price rises on so that the normal people don't start pointing their fingers at the Federal Reserve Bank and the other central banks around the world. So 20 to 50% just starting on Monday is huge for Germans. That's crazy. And that's not going to go down again. Remember in the United States, they were calling it transitory for a while when inflation got it was like 6-7% year over year. At some point it got to some really high number last year and they were like, oh, it's transitory. And then a few months later, well, it's not really transitory. It just kept going up after that. And then consumer price inflation year over year in Germany is now like 7.6%. Consumer prices already went up an average of 7.3% in February in Germany. This is just Germany. I only know all this stuff because I just read the article about Germany. But anyways, that's just what's happening in one country. And of course, they're blaming it all on Ukraine, right? Supply chain stuff. But obviously what's really been going on for the last 100 years and further back than that, and accelerating in very recent years is just the endless printing of fiat currency and hyperinflation. Look at the United States dollar. 80% of all United States dollars have been magicked into existence in the last 2 years. That's how much the money printing has increased in the last couple of years. They just printed trillions more dollars. So the famous line from one of Ernest Hemingway's writings, which is used to describe anything from addictions to hyperinflation, is something like, how did you go bankrupt? Well, first it happened gradually, then suddenly. So that's how hyperinflation, at first it happens gradually. And it was happening gradually for a very long time. And now it's starting to happen a bit more suddenly. Now we're starting to see massive price hikes at the grocery store and the pump. So noticeable that even the normie pleb unwashed masses are actually starting to notice it and get mad about it. Just like I said, why it has to be blamed on COVID, crane, whatever's coming next. All right? Aliens. So that's happening. Anyways, So in these situations, a lot of people like to think, well, I have my stash of gold and silver, so that's okay. If the currency starts, imagine your current, it's not just prices going up 20% and then staying there for a few months and going up again. Eventually it gets to the point where it's uncontrollable, and food prices are doubling, tripling every single day. That's Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, all classic scenarios like that. People were carrying around wheelbarrows of trillion-dollar bills to pay for basic things until everything the whole currency just collapsed. But governments pretend they can hold on until it's way, 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 way too late. And so people like to think, well, because I have my gold and silver, I'll be able to go to the grocery store and buy things still. Everyone else, their savings will be wiped to nothing, but at least I'll still have money to spend. And they think that the people, like in Venezuela, for example, the people who had all the pesos weren't diversified, lost everything they had because the peso went down in value ridiculously. And of course the economy was terrible, nobody was making money. I think those people couldn't go to the store and buy stuff, but the people who had saved up in gold and silver or Bitcoin, they preserved their wealth, so they could go to the store and still buy stuff. That's not how it worked. What actually happened is there's simply no stuff in the store to buy. So it doesn't matter how much gold you have at that point. During those months of crisis when that happens, and it's going to be happening for months, it isn't going to go on for months, there's going to be no food in the stores. There may be just barely enough to feed people, government food lines, rations, things like that. In Venezuela, the people without the pesos were just going out into farmers' fields and just killing cows right in the field and taking the meat. They were ambushing food delivery trucks and just stealing all the food out of them and leaving them stranded on the highway. Things like that were happening. So just because you have your assets diversified doesn't mean you're in good shape for something like that. I could have responded to my friend and told him the very typical advice, like, just invest in gold, silver, and Bitcoin, and your wealth will be preserved, no problem, hyperinflation proof. And those things should be resistant to hyperinflation, but it's not going to help you during the period of that crisis. You still need to have whatever it is you need to survive during that time. Because you could have gold that's worth a lot of money, but there's going to be food shortages everywhere. There's no goods, and stores can't. It gets to a point where stores can't increase their prices to keep up with the printing up money, the inflation. The reason they can't is because governments always institute price freezes. At some point during the hyperinflationary crisis, all governments always will until the end of time institute price caps. And price caps are terrible because it's like the currency is losing 95% of its value every single day, or having value every day. And so, but you have to sell the bread at the same price. So normally, say your bread was $5. Now you have to sell it at something that's now worth $2.50 and not something that's now worth. And eventually, it gets to the point where the government's requiring you to sell a loaf of bread for 5 cents for what is now worth 5 cents. And you just can't, because then you're basically giving all your bread out for free. So what do? You either have your shelves empty and keep your store open and say you just can't get bread, or you close down. In Venezuela, there were police officers going around and arresting bread store owners for selling bread at above the government price cap, right? So you have to be prepared to deal with the situation. It's not just about diversifying your assets, it's about being prepared to deal with a situation where there is simply nothing to buy. Because prices are going up so fast, stores just can't keep up with it, and people are already went out and panic bought everything because they see a crisis coming, and the government's just preventing stores from selling things at any price because they institute price caps. So that's what happens during those times. And then, So, Venezuela is one example. Obviously, the two stark examples that everybody knows is Zimbabwe and the Weimar Republic and Germany, but also similar things have happened, like Argentina had a currency crisis. Some of these countries had currency crises that didn't quite evolve into full-on hyperinflation, but they got pretty serious, where people might have had 95% of their wealth wiped out due to money printing. That can very easily happen. So anyways, we're seeing it happen. We were seeing it happen gradually for anyone who's paying attention for as long as I've been alive, but just the last few years it's been happening more suddenly. And now normal people are starting to notice it, but they're still believing the mainstream narrative that it's just because of COVID or Ukraine. It's not, because 80% of dollars have been printed into existence over the last 2 years, and now they just have these convenient crises to blame it on, right? Normal people are starting to notice, so what's going to come next? I can't predict the future. Maybe the government will magically be able to stop hyperinflation, but generally the way the economics works is once you've created the conditions for hyperinflation, There's absolutely nothing you can do. Central bank policy cannot fix what's already been done. It's basically what's coming next has already been what can come next in terms of hyperinflation. Whether it starts now or next year or in 3 years, whatever, 5 years, whenever it happens, it can't be undone. Central banks can furiously try to fight it and they won't be able to. A recent metaphor that I read was that describes it kind of accurately is if you drive somebody over with your car and they're dead, and then right after you did it, you realize, oh, that was bad, and you try to reverse what you did by backing over, putting the car in reverse and driving back over them in the opposite direction. And you think, oh, now they can get up and walk again, right? So central banks have already created these conditions, inflating the money supply. That's what inflation is. And they call inflation like consumer price inflation. They want people to think that inflation is just prices going up. So then they can blame it on whatever. But really, in terms of economics, inflation is the inflation of the money supply. Consumer price inflation is just consumer prices going up. It's not really inflation of anything. It's just prices are going up. And the reason for that is because the value of the currency that you are buying it with is going down in comparison to everything else, because so many are being printed. The money being printed is the actual inflation. When you hear CPI, it's kind of a funny term. It's kind of to mislead people. Consumer price inflation. Really, money supply inflation is inflation. When consumer prices have been going up steadily every single year, and they start going up more and more and more, and they start doing that, and then Germany's just like 20 to 50% food price increase tomorrow. Boom. If they're at 7.6% year over year inflation in Germany, their consumer price index. I'm sorry, actually CPI I believe stands for consumer price index. I kept saying consumer price inflation, but they say price inflation. It's a dishonest term. So the consumer price index, which is an index of consumer prices in Germany, already at 7.6%. Imagine what percent it's going to be at when food goes up 20 to 50% in all German major grocery chains tomorrow. I don't know what their CPI is going to be at the end of the month. It's probably going to be higher. Who knows where it's going to go after that. I mentioned in previous videos, just so y'all have a little bit more economic literacy, anyone who's not aware of this yet, this CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, is an algorithm using a basket of typical consumer goods, where they basically take the average price of a certain group of consumer goods that's meant to indicate what people buy in their lives, in their normal day-to-day lives, and they track the increase in price of that every month, or decrease, but it's usually an increase because they're always printing money. And so that gives you a percent. It's like so that's meant to indicate the consumer lifestyle, and how the average consumer is going to be affected. Their purchasing power is going down as the CPI goes up. The problem with the algorithm is it's hedonistic. They adjust it to meet their own goals. So it used to be calculated in a different way, and then once inflation looked like it was going up a lot, they changed the way it was calculated to make it look like it was less. And they have ways to continually adjust it. It's not very accurate. The other thing to consider is like the most important things: food and energy. Energy, whether that be heating the house in the winter, electricity bill, and then food. Those are the most important things that people buy. And for really people who don't make very much money, in other words, the poor, food and energy makes up a very large percent of their expenditure. It takes up a huge amount of their income. The people who are very, very wealthy and have lots of money, food and energy makes up a very tiny percent of their income. Now, they're still spending way more money on food and energy than the poor people, because they probably have like yachts and huge mansions to heat. But as a percent of their total income, it's way smaller. Okay, so it affects them much less. When those prices go up, their food and energy costs might go from 2.5% to 5% of their income or something like that. But if you're poor and food and energy goes up a lot, and instead of spending 60% of your income on food and energy, you might have to start spending 90% of your income, and then it might be 120%, and now you can't do anything anymore, so you have to either use less energy or less food, or both, or start buying cheaper food with more chemicals in it. Anyway, so that's how that works. So that's why kind of like CPI for who? Because the CPI for somebody who makes 8,000 United States dollars a year is going to be totally different indicator than for somebody who makes $1 million per year. So who is the CPI for? Who do they base that algorithm on? I assume they base it on like a middle class family in the United States. They look at their expenditures. But again, it doesn't really matter, because inflation is going to hit the lower class much harder. It's going to hit the rich much less. Another good thing to mention about stocks, a lot of people don't really know what happens to stocks in hyperinflation. They think economic collapse, what happens? Crash. The stock market is going to crash, right? It's not really what happens. It does, of course, eventually, but at first it goes way up. Anyone right now who's looking at the stock market and is like, I'm not going to buy it, it's so high, it's just going to crash. No, it's going to skyrocket, the stock market. It's going to skyrocket. But stock market valued in dollars, skyrocketing, right? And the dollar is plummeting. So the stock market goes up really, really high, but you still end up losing lots of money. Say, for example, I don't remember the exact figures from the Weimar Republic, but it could be something like the stock market goes up 660,000% in a very short period of time. But it doesn't matter because the currency crashed down to literally nothing, right? So it accomplishes nothing. Your stocks, don't worry, if you're heavily invested in stocks, your stocks will go way up in dollar value during a hyperinflationary event, after which they will immediately crash. But they will go way up first. But it doesn't matter if you sell at the top, because you're selling at the top into worthless currency. So when it's going way upwards in currency, it's staying the same or going way down in gold and oil and other hard assets that are finite and can't be printed out of thin air. That's kind of how that works. Hope you all enjoyed the video. Have any questions or comments? Ask below.